It's 2 a.m. somewhere in northern France. The year is 1917. You're lying on a canvas stretcher, and you can't feel your right leg. A man in a blood-soaked apron leans over you. He needs to see inside your wound. He needs to find the bleeding before you run out of blood to lose. But here's the problem. He can't turn on a light, not because there isn't one. Because if he does, in less than 90 seconds, German artillery spotters 2 miles away will see the glow leaking through the tent canvas, and they will aim for it. So the surgeon who is about to save your life has to do it in the dark. How do you operate on a human body, when light itself is the thing that gets you killed? The problem nobody warned you about. We think of electricity as something hospitals have. A convenience, like air conditioning, like elevators. It isn't. Electricity in a modern hospital is the thing holding back chaos. The moment it disappears, dozens of invisible systems collapse at once, and almost none of them are the ones you'd guess first. Most people assume the biggest danger is the dark. It's not. The biggest danger is refrigeration. Blood for transfusions has to stay cold. Insulin has to stay cold. Vaccines, antitoxins, anesthetic drugs, all of them spoil within hours in summer heat. So the moment the power dies, a clock starts ticking that has nothing to do with light at all. Somewhere a refrigerator full of blood is quietly warming up and nobody in the building can hear it happening. Then there's sterilization. Surgical instruments are sterilized using heat, boiling water, steam autoclaves. No power often means no reliable heat source strong enough to kill bacteria, which means every clean instrument is now a guess. Then there's the part almost nobody thinks of at all: pumps. Modern hospitals pump water through pipes using electric motors. No power, and in many buildings the taps simply stop. No running water. In a building full of open wounds. So before a single light bulb goes dark, 3 invisible disasters are already unfolding: spoiling blood, unverified sterility, and dry taps. And they haven't even gotten to the part where someone needs surgery in the next 10 minutes. 1917, the tent where light is the enemy. Let's go back to that tent in France. You'd think a battlefield hospital, a casualty clearing station they called it, would want all the light it could get. Wounded men are pouring in faster than anyone can sort them. Surgeons are working in shifts that don't end. Every second of visibility should be precious. Instead, light is treated like a weapon pointed at everyone inside. Here's why. A canvas tent glowing in the dark on a flat battlefield landscape is visible from miles away. Artillery spotters used exactly this kind of glow to range their guns. More than one field hospital was shelled, not because it was a deliberate target, but because it was simply the brightest thing on a dark horizon. So surgeons operated under blackout lamps, kerosene lanterns wrapped in heavy cloth hoods, throwing a dim cone of light downward onto the operating table and almost nothing else. Tent flaps were sealed. Windows, where they existed, were painted black or covered in thick curtains. Now picture what that actually means for the man holding the scalpel. He's trying to locate shrapnel buried inside torn muscle, in light barely strong enough to read a newspaper by. He can't ask for more light. More light might mean more shelling, might mean the tent next to his, full of 200 wounded men, becomes the next target. So he adapts. Surgeons of this era trained themselves to operate as much by feel as by sight, fingers reading tissue the way the eyes normally would, locating bone fragments and bleeders through pressure and texture. It sounds almost impossible. It was standard practice. But touch alone doesn't stop a man from bleeding out. And there's a second danger hiding inside that dim lantern itself, one that has nothing to do with snipers or spotters at all. Open flame, kerosene, canvas tent walls, oxygen tanks sitting nearby for resuscitation. Put all of those in one enclosed space, and you've built something that doesn't just risk being seen by the enemy. It risks catching fire from the inside. More than one field hospital lost equipment, supplies, even patients, not to a bomb at all, but to a knocked-over lamp in a tent crowded with exhausted men moving too fast in too little light. So now the surgeon isn't just racing the clock on a dying patient. He's balancing a flame he can't extinguish, in a space he can't ventilate, surrounded by oxygen he can't move. One mystery solved. A second one quietly created. And that's where the next twist comes in. 3. The solution that created a new problem: military medicine solved the lighting problem in a way you wouldn't expect. They didn't try to make light safer, they tried to make darkness less necessary, by making the work faster. This is where triage was born in its modern form. Not as paperwork, as a survival algorithm performed at the edge of a blackout tent, in seconds by torchlight a doctor wasn't even supposed to use for long. Wounded men were sorted into categories, the instant they arrived: those who would survive without immediate surgery, those who needed it now, and those who were beyond saving no matter what. It sounds brutal, it was, but it meant the dim, dangerous operating light was only ever used on the cases where it could actually change the outcome. Because faster was less time, the lantern stayed lit. Less time, the tent stayed bright. Less time, everyone inside stayed a target. Speed became a form of camouflage, but solving the light problem exposed something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with vision at all. IV, the thing no light can fix. You can work around darkness, you cannot work around infection. In a world before reliable electricity, and for decades after electricity existed, but before antibiotics existed, the deadliest enemy in any field hospital wasn't visible at all. Here's the assumption almost everyone gets wrong: that surgery in the earliest 20th century failed mostly because of crude tools or shaky hands. It didn't. The tools were often excellent. The hands were often brilliant. Soldiers survived horrific wounds on the table, and then died days later in a clean bed, from infections nobody could see coming. Without dependable electric sterilizers, hospitals leaned on something older and stranger: fire. Instruments were passed through open flame. Dressings were boiled in massive cauldrons over wood or coal. Entire wards sometimes filled with the smell of carbolic acid and scorched metal. The unmistakable scent of medicine trying to outrun bacteria with nothing but heat and chemistry. It worked. Sort of. Just not fast enough and not always thoroughly enough, in buildings overwhelmed with hundreds of wounded arriving at once. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. The blood problem nobody could see coming. Here's something that sounds almost too strange to be true. For much of this era, doctors weren't entirely sure whose blood could go into whose body. Blood typing existed, barely. It had been discovered only a few years before the First World War began, and most field surgeons had no fast, reliable way to test for it under combat conditions, let alone in the dark. Giving a wounded man the wrong blood type could kill him just as surely as the shrapnel that put him on the table in the first place. So, picture the decision a surgeon faces in that blackout tent. A soldier in front of him is losing blood faster than his body can replace it. There's a transfusion kit nearby, but verifying a match takes time, light, and equipment that may not even be reliably available. Sometimes they used universal donor blood when they could get it. A workaround discovered just in time for the war, where one blood type could be given to almost anyone in an emergency without immediately fatal results. It wasn't perfect. It bought time, and time, in a tent that couldn't stay lit for long, was the only currency that actually mattered. Every solved problem in this story reveals another problem hiding directly behind it. Light, speed, sterility. Now blood itself becomes a gamble made in darkness, against a clock nobody can see. But even if the bleeding stops, even if the blood matches, there's one more variable nobody in that tent can control: pain. Sick. The sound that told you something was wrong. Anesthesia in this era wasn't the precise monitored science it is now. It was often a soaked cloth, a mask, a hand judging dosage by instinct and experience rather than machines reading vital signs in real time. There were no glowing monitors counting heartbeats per minute, no electronic alarms warning a doctor that something had quietly gone wrong. There was only sound and touch and attention. A trained ear could catch a change in breathing before anything else gave it away. A shift from steady to shallow. A pause that lasted half a second too long. In a blacked-out tent where eyes were nearly useless, sound became the body's emergency alarm system. And the people running that system were exhausted humans, working hour after hour, expected to notice what no machine was there to notice for them. Imagine being responsible for keeping a man unconscious enough to survive surgery, and conscious enough to keep breathing, using nothing but your ears, in a tent lit by a single shielded flame, with German guns somewhere in the distance. One miscalculation. One mischange in breathing, and there's no monitor to catch what a tired human missed. This is the part of the story almost nobody tells you. Survival in these hospitals didn't come from heroic individual brilliance. It came from systems of attention, layers of trained humans backing each other up, each one a living sensor in a building with no electronic ones. And just when military medicine started to adapt to all of this, light discipline, faster surgery, blood workarounds, sound-based monitoring, a second war arrived. And this time, the danger wasn't only on a foreign battlefield. This time, it followed people home. The night shift nobody talks about. Imagine being a nurse in 1943 in a hospital in London during a blackout. The city outside is utterly black on purpose, every window covered, every street lamp dead, because German bombers are using light the same way artillery spotters did decades earlier. As a map, inside the hospital, the rules are absolute. No light visible from outside, not a sliver. Wardens patrol the streets specifically looking for the thin gold line under a curtain, the careless flicker of a struck match. Now a patient's condition changes for the worse at 3 a.m. The nurse needs to see his face, check his pulse, examine a wound that may be bleeding again under the bandages. She has a small electric torch, and even that has to be angled downward, cupped almost shut, used for seconds at a time. Some nurses worked with red-filtered lights because red light is far less visible from a distance and far less damaging to night vision, letting their eyes adjust back to the same dark almost instantly. She's essentially doing nursing, a job built entirely around careful observation, while being told, by law, to observe as little as possible. And here's the twist most people never consider. The blackout didn't just hide hospitals from bombers, it also hid mistakes from everyone else. In near-total darkness, medication errors rose. Falls increased. Nurses misjudged distances, knocked over trays, lost track of which patient was which in wards holding dozens of identical beds. The very darkness meant to protect the hospital from outside threats was quietly creating threats inside it. So the hospitals adapted again. And this adaptation is the one that still echoes through every hospital on Earth today. Routines were restructured so that anything requiring real light, changing major dressings, administering precise medication doses, conducting examinations, happened during daylight hours whenever humanly possible. Night shifts shifted from treatment time to monitoring and stabilization time. The day became the surgical window. The night became the watching window. This is quietly the ancestor of the modern hospital shift structure. Day teams handling procedures, night teams handling observation and emergencies only. We treat it today as just logical efficiency. It was originally born from bombs, and there's a second invention hiding in this story, one even stranger than shift schedules. Hospitals began stockpiling, not just bandages and morphine, but light itself in storable form. Candles, oil lamps, hand-cranked torches that needed no batteries at all, because batteries were rationed and unreliable. Glow-in-the-dark paint was used on light switches, on the edges of stairs, on door handles, so staff could navigate critical pathways using nothing but the residual glow of paint that had been charged by daylight hours earlier. A hospital corridor, lit only by paint remembering the sun. That's not poetry. That's a real wartime engineering solution. What this reveals about us, step back from the war for a second. What's actually happening in this story isn't really about electricity at all. It's about something deeper. The fact that human survival has never depended on having the right tools. It's depended on something far rarer, the ability to redesign behavior around a missing tool fast enough to keep people alive anyway. Light didn't disappear because humans got worse at medicine. It disappeared because of war, because of danger, because circumstances changed faster than infrastructure could. And every single time that happened throughout history, in 1917 tents, in 1943 blackout wards, in candlelit operating rooms a century earlier, humans didn't wait for the lights to come back on. They rebuilt the entire workflow around the dark. This is weirdly one of the oldest survival instincts we have. Not strength, not tools. Adaptability under constraint. The same instinct that let early humans keep hunting after losing fire, that let sailors navigate oceans by starlight alone, that let surgeons learn to read torn muscle with their fingertips instead of their eyes. Every solution in the story created a new problem. Dimming the lights stopped the shelling, that slowed the surgery. Speeding up the surgery saved time, but increased the risk of mistakes. Hiding the wards from bombers protected them, but blinded the nurses inside. There was no clean fix. There was only the next adaptation, and the one after that. That's the part the history books skip. We remember they had no electricity as a simple fact. We rarely sit with what that actually meant, minute to minute, for the person holding the scalpel, or the person on the table beneath it. And maybe the strangest part of all this is who actually carried the weight of these adaptations. Not inventors, not engineers. Ordinary nurses memorizing ward layouts in total darkness so they could navigate by memory alone. Ordinary surgeons training their hands to see through touch. Ordinary orderlies learning to read a man's breathing instead of a screen. None of them are remembered by name. There's no monument to the nurse who caught a falling patient by sound alone, or the surgeon who finished an amputation in 11 minutes because 11 minutes was all the dark would allow. Their entire skill set existed only because the world had taken something away from them. Not because humans got worse, because we no longer need it. Electricity came back, stayed reliable, and the elaborate, fragile, brilliant workaround systems quietly disappeared into history. Until the next blackout, the next disaster, the next reminder that they might be needed again. The question hospitals still ask. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Modern hospitals still plan for this. Right now, today, every major hospital on Earth has a blackout protocol, not for bombs but for storms, grid failures, cyber attacks on power infrastructure. Backup generators, battery reserves for critical equipment, staff drilled on what to do in the first 90 seconds after the power dies. Because the lesson from 1917 and 1943 never actually expired, it just changed its disguise. The fragile point in modern medicine was never the lack of electricity. It was always the assumption that electricity would simply always be there. So the next time the lights in your house flicker, just for a second, just long enough to notice, remember the tent in France, and the ward in London. Remember that somewhere not very long ago, a person's survival depended entirely on a stranger's steady hands, finding their way through total darkness. And that the same instinct that guided those hands is still sitting quietly inside every one of us, waiting for the moment the lights go out and someone has to decide what happens next.